talking about Heraclitus, the dark one, who said everything is in a constant state of flux. And the little jingle that helps me remember it, and that was in Disney's Pocahontas movie, was that song about you can never step in the same river twice, right? Because everything's changing, everything's moving, including yourself. And so you actually become different as you travel, as well as the other people you know, the places you go to. And that's why fire was such a great representative of him. And I don't know if he meant that literal or figurative, maybe a little bit of both, but having that cosmic fire from which everything comes. But like fire, fire consumes fuel, but it gives off heat and light. So it's kind of like this cosmic loop sort of thing that Heraclitus is imagining. And later when we get to the Stoics, they take that exploding cosmic egg theme into a really interesting direction. And but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So I felt like we rushed his disciple Parmenides a little bit. So if you remember, his disciple Parmenides said, you can never step in the same river once. And the reason is because there is only one thing, one time, one place. And if that is the reality, then yeah, movement becomes nonsensical. You can't divide things because there's no place to put the two torn pieces apart, right? If there's only one thing, one place, one time. You can't move because there's no place to go because you're already there. Right? It's very helpful in the sense that you always know where you are. Where are you? Here. You always know what day it is, today, and you always know what time it is, now. Unfortunately, you also realize you can't get there from here, because there is no there. There's only here. You guys are looking at me with blank looks. I actually believe this is so much more logical and rational than the other views. It's not even funny. And it actually lines up more with what we know about quantum physics and mechanics than these other views. And I think it also lines up kind of with this idea of God is all. Okay, but this is where these ancient Greek materialists are so interesting. He's not talking a spiritual oneness like Buddhists or Hindus or Taoists. He's talking physical. And that's what causes me this weird cognitive glitch in my head. But anyways, did you guys understand Zeno's paradoxes? Why the tortoise could, I didn't do that one. So in the famed classic Tortoise and the Hare race, and remember Zeno was his philosophy buddy that was giving him these paradoxical arguments. And in philosophy, it's called argumentum ad absurdum, where you take your opponent's point of view and you argue it to its logical conclusions. If you've never tried that, please do. It's great fun. Just take whatever the opposite point of view is and just logically follow it to its destination, and then show that back to the person that is pushing that point of view. And that's what Zeno was doing. He was taking these assumptions the Greeks had, that you could move, that you could divide things, that you could hit a target with an arrow, and he showed logically why that was not possible. Fascinating. And this creates a new tension in philosophy, or two schools of camp. So far, everyone we talked about so far were empiricists. Ryan, what was that again?
The senses.
Yes. You understand things through sense perception. That's how you gain knowledge. Like there's a world out there, and as you take it in, that is what gives you knowledge. Parmenides is saying you can't trust your senses because it looks like we're separated by time and space, right? But if we know there's only one thing, one time, one place, our senses have to be deceiving us. So we have to resort to reason, and these are called the Rationalists. And this is a fight still going on to this day, where you have people pitting reason, or what's taking place in their mind, versus what they're experiencing with their senses.
This kind of reminds me of like when you describe these groups of people that believe whatever about theology. It reminds me of like Game of Thrones.
I don't know about
Okay,
that.
never mind.
You can tell me sometime.
Well, I'm a bad person, I watch games.
I tried. I love that genre. It just, I didn't make it past the first episode. It was a little too
Word.
graphic for me.
Okay, all right.
Certain things were too graphic for me.
Well, never mind.
Okay.
Please
Anyways.
Give my second myself.
It's all right. Just, good old medieval slaughter, right, and all that. Where were we? Rationalist. So this idea is, well, let's just start simple. Have your senses ever deceived you? Who said? No. To me, one of the great joys in life is optical illusions and messing with people's sense perception and challenging things. So, one of my all-time favorite artists is M.C. Escher, if you're familiar with him, a graphic artist. One of his most famous work is two hands drawing each other on a piece of paper, so cool. And another, I used to have it in my office, but students would run out of my office screaming. It was called Ascending and Descending, and it had a staircase on top of this monastery, and depending on which way you looked, half the monks were going up the stairs and the other monks were going down the stairs, but it was the same stairs. It was a perpetual, never taking you anywhere staircase that went up and down, and you're just going, what? So he could draw things on paper that you could never construct physically in a three-dimensional world, but using the optics of illusion. Like those of you who studied art or know depth perception, if we make objects smaller, often the distance, right, it gives the illusion of distance, and things get close. As they get closer, they seem bigger. Back when I believed in dating, I used to go out with this woman, and she was a very intelligent woman. But one day, this giant hawk flew over our head, and I said, "Would you look at the size of that hawk?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, Fred, that's really big. It's like that big." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, you mean like that airplane over there that's that big?" And I said, "We're not dating anymore, in case you wanted." But weirdness. When my nephew was young and he lived with me, we would every year go up to Oregon. I had an old VW bus, and I try to drive late to miss the traffic in LA in the Bay Area. And one night, the fumes from my bus were getting to us. My nephew was like my canary. When he passed out, I knew we needed to roll down the windows because he was a little bit younger than me. But he had passed out, and I was in that groggy kind of road where you say, and I looked up, and here's this semi-truck in my lane looking straight at me. And I had a quick heart palpitation, and then I realized it was being towed by a tow truck. But my nephew, being asleep, did not know all that. And so I just screamed and I said, "We're gonna die." And he looks up and there's that semi-truck right in front of our thing. But that is our senses deceiving us into thinking something is one way, and we use our reason to make those adjustments. Like, no, that really is a big plane or a big bird. It's the distance that's making it look small, etc. So all the time we're using our reason to recalibrate and to adjust what our sense perceptions are telling us. Does that make sense? Okay. But this gets so severe, we literally have a parting of the ways where one camp is now going to only trust their reason, and the other camp is saying, no, we have to trust our experiences. It's our reason that messes things up. But you will see this theme come up over and over. One more paradox. I showed you why you can't divide things, why you can't travel from me to you, because there's an infinite amount of space between us, and I showed you that on the timeline. Same thing with the tortoise and the hare problem. Say you've got the hare, and here's the starting line, and he's given the tortoise a head start. Okay. So it's going to take a certain amount of time for the hare to get to point A to point B, where the tortoise was starting. But in that amount of time, even if the tortoise is moving slowly, he will have moved from this point. So say he's only able to go this far. Right. So now, in order for the hare to catch where the tortoise is now, he has to travel here, but that will take a certain amount of time. In that time, the tortoise will also have moved. You see, we're running into the same timeline problem. Since time is involved, how is the rabbit ever going to catch up with the tortoise, since the tortoise will keep moving? And at least at this point in the Greeks' mathematical history, they didn't have equations to compensate for speed, trajectory, travel, etc. Kind of like with the problem I showed you with the tearing of the paper. I think it took almost 1,500 years for mathematicians to solve that problem. And actually one of the students after class knew the answer. And it had to do with, as I was tearing that piece of paper into infinite parts, what I was doing was I was halving it infinitely in one direction. But that does not mean the paper's infinitely large. Yes, it could theoretically be infinitely small, but that doesn't double the paper every time I tear it, right? So it's like a one-directional infinity that way, instead of double infinity. And I didn't even know, I'm not great at math. I just thought infinity equals infinity, but there's different types of infinity. Fascinating. Any other questions on that? So this wraps up our monistic materialist. That's some nice alliteration. What does that mean? What's a monistic materialist? Everyone we've talked about so far falls under that category, from Thales to Parmenides.
There's only one physical substance.
Yes, only one physical substance. And you see in their wrestling with it, they end up coming up with what turns out to be the 4 elements in Greek culture or thought: earth, air, fire, and water. Even though I said, if there was an earth guy, I don't know, we don't have writings from him, but we had Thales with water, I want you to know that, Anaxagoras with air, and then Heraclitus with fire. So the next group we're going to deal with, these folks are called the Pluralists. Unlike the monists before them, who were in search of the Urstoff, or that underlying substance of all things, the Pluralists were much more apt to see a multiplicity of building blocks upon which the cosmos was created. The Pluralists were also much more eclectic than their monistic counterparts, for they were willing to mix and match the ideas of those who came before them instead of starting from scratch. And so our first pluralist, now they're still materialists, they still believe everything's made up of matter, but they're starting to think, these were all brilliant guys. Maybe instead of them all being wrong, they were all a little bit right. And so Empedocles is quite novel in saying, what if it's not just one underlying physical substance, but it's a combination of earth, air, fire, and water? Does anyone know the Chinese elements? They have 5. Culture is so interesting.
Isn't the 5th one spirit?
No. They split earth into 2. Anyone know what? Because they have fire, air, and water, but then they don't have earth. They have, anyone?
Is it wood and metal?
Yes, wood and metal. Very good, which both come from the earth. So those are the 5 Chinese elements, and if you've studied like feng shui or Chinese horoscope, astrology, that's all kind of tied into body types, temperaments, personalities, etc. And welcome to the year of the rat. Okay. Hope it serves you well. Year of the rat. Okay, so Empedocles believes all these things can be brought together, and let me see if I can read a little bit from him. Here, we only have fragments of Empedocles, but here's some of his writing. Here first the 4 roots of all things: shining Zeus, life-bringing Hera, Adonis, and Nestus, whose teardrops are a wellspring to mortals. And I will tell you another thing: there is no substance of any of all the things that die, nor any cessation for them of depraved death. They are only a mingling and interchange of what has been mingled. Substance is but a name given to these things by people. But they hold that when light and air chance to have been mingled in the fashion of a human, or in the fashion of a race of wild beasts or of plants or birds, that is to be born. And when these things have been separated once more, that call it wrongly woeful death. I follow the custom and call it to myself avenging death. Fools, for they have no far-reaching thoughts who deem that what before was not comes into being, or that anything can perish and be utterly destroyed. For I cannot be that anything can arise from what in no way is, and it is impossible and unheard of that what is should perish, for it will always be, wherever one may keep putting it. And so his idea is these four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, are basically eternal. They can't be created or destroyed. But when you see like a human, we are made up of a combination of those elements, primarily water, but we also have minerals. We also have air for breath, and then fire would be like our spirit, or that life force. And that's who we are. I'm made up of earth, air, fire, and water, according to the Greeks. And when I die, it doesn't mean this just disappears or goes out of existence. My elements break back down into those parts and go back into the cosmos and await for the next life to gather them and form anew. And this is so fascinating to think about. Think about how life begins. From the intricacy of a nautilus shell, it starts just the same way, sperm and egg, and from that little zygote, there's a DNA blueprint, and somehow this creature can gather elements like calcium carbonate and things from the ocean water, and it has this template inside its genetics, and it is constructing these particles it's taking from nature, and it's creating this elaborate shell, including the flesh, mostly made up of water, that lives inside this calcium carbonate home. Amazing. But when that nautilus dies or is eaten, those parts are broken back down and redispersed. It's like the circle of life, right? That whole process. Questions, comments on Empedocles? Our next guy is an Anaxagoras. And Anaxagoras like to think in terms of opposites, which worked upon the material world, causing perceptual changes. Rather than love and hate being the active forces to join or separate matter, Anaxagoras chose condensation and rarefaction. So let me go back to that. I do like to think about Empedocles. Did I spell that right? Empedocles. I like to call him like the Captain Antonio philosopher. I know that's way before your time. Anyone know that their big hit, Love Will Keep Us Together? Okay, well, Google it, YouTube it. He believed love is what brings the elements together to create new life, new things, from human love to this more abstract love in nature, but hate is what breaks things apart. And so he saw this creation as like an act of love and destruction as an act of hate. So love keeps us together, hate breaks us apart, even at the physical material level. Testing. Now for Anaxagoras, it wasn't these abstract concepts of love and hate that brought elements together and divided them, but Anaxagoras saw it as kind of like we talked about with Anaximenes, with the air. Compression and rarefaction. Compressed things solidify, and rarefied things burst into flame. So like gas would be super rarefied matter, and ultimately bursting into flame, and solids would be super compressed stuff put together. All right. Next for and that's all I want you to remember for these guys. For Empedocles, that he kind of started this pluralism thing. It's not just one element, but it's a combination of many. And love and hate is what brought things together, broke it apart. And then for Anaxagoras, he's also a pluralist, but he's into rarefaction and condensation. The next two people I'm going to do as a team, a match set. And this is Leucippus, also of Miletus, where Thales came from. And his buddy Democritus. And together, they are collectively called the Atomists. Now, we are talking 5th century BC or BCE. They're already thinking of atomic theory. Now, not like modern atomic theory, but what Leucippus and Democritus believed was that the world was made up of these invisible particles that are eternal. They've always been there, but they're broken down into such fine fragments that we can't see them with the human eye. But when enough of these particles join together, they get big enough so we can actually see them. And so he's not saying like a human. If we take a human being, they're not made up of microscopic, tiny humans. It's not that wild, although close. But what he is saying is, if we took human hair and we magnified it, what we would find is it's made up of all these little invisible hairs, particles. And so when this human dies and their hair decomposes, all those little hair particles go back into the mix and await for some creature that needs to grow hair, and their blueprint is gathering it and using it to make it. So another example, a bone. A bone would simply be made up of all these invisible bone particles that are put together. This theory so captured the imagination of modern scientists that when the atom was actually discovered, they called it based on these two guys, because they were, and they did this without microscopes, without telescopes, just with their thoughts is what they came up with, this understanding of how things must be made and how they break down when they're done. In addition to this atomic theory of life, or these invisible particles, they also believed that life could not be in the past like it was today. And they speculated that life probably came from the sea and then changed or evolved. They didn't use the word evolve per se, but they basically were presenting a very Darwinian theory of evolution in the 5th century. So what Darwin presented in the 19th century was nothing new. What was new in his presentation was it was a materialistic way for the world to come about without the intervention of gods. But for all intents and purposes, as far as I can tell, Democritus and Leucippus, along with many of these other early philosophers, kind of gave a customary nod to the gods. But please, I mean, let's be serious. That's for the common people, the people that don't really think or observe. We don't have to worry about that stuff. But you do have to worry about the people and the city and their devotion. And we're going to get to some people that suffered because of that, because they weren't quite so cautious about their comments about the gods or goddesses. Any questions about, man, I did that a lot quicker than I was thinking. So we got the monistic materialist, then we got the pluralist. Any other questions before we move on? All right, easy peasy. All right, the next part of this book is called The Age of Socrates, and I want to give you a little background. So Socrates lived in Athens, and at this time, a group of people had arisen called the Sophists. Does anyone know what a sophist is?
Sophisticated?
No. Sophist? Sophistry, have you ever heard that word? I guess it's getting a little archaic, but it's a good one. You should use it, because it's happening all over the place. These were people that excelled in the art of rhetoric. Does anyone know what rhetoric is?
Question thing.
And debate. It's like public speaking, how to have an argument, a debate. And part of how the sophists would demonstrate their prowess and their skills, they would just say, pick any topic. And then they would argue passionately on one side of that issue. Then, without missing a beat, they would step over and argue just as passionately against what they had just argued. Because the Sophists, after seeing all these other philosophers, they despaired of knowing truth. They believed we simply can't know as humans. It's just a matter of opinion. We have all these brilliant people saying different things, so who can know? And since Athens was a very litigious state, but there weren't professional lawyers, the families would want at least one member of the family to study law to be able to defend the interests of the clan, of their household. And so this was a very desired thing. The problem was they became great persuaders and communicators, but they didn't care about truth because they didn't believe in it, or they at least didn't believe we could know it. So the next best thing was for you to be able to tell the most believable or persuasive story. Does it sound familiar? Okay, right. It's stunning to think about this today. Another two groups also lived at this time. We have the skeptics, and we still use that word today in English, right, for skepticism. Or you're doubtful, you want to question, you don't just assume people are speaking truthfully or correctly. You kind of are suspending your judgment. And then the cynics are maybe a little bit darker, where they just assume you're up to no good. A lot of people have said dogs are the most cynical animal, because if you walk by a house that's not your own and a dog knows you're there, it just assumes you're there to rob, steal, cause mischief, right? It's just going off. And that's kind of how a cynic's mindset is. No one gets something for nothing, nothing's for free, you pay as you go. So if someone's telling you, have I got a deal for you, a cynic is just like, yeah, tell me about it. I don't buy it. What's the bottom line? So super realistic, pragmatic, and skeptical. And so that deeper inversion we would call the cynic. This is the world, this is the Athens that Socrates is living in. But unlike the Sophist, he was also a great communicator. He was great at rhetoric. He was great at questions and answers. But he actually believed there was truth. Now, he didn't claim to know it, but he thought it was at least there. So he was searching. He was a seeker after the truth. And the way he went about it, and we still call it the Socratic method today, which I hope we get to do more in this class, when someone came to Athens and claimed to know something like honor or courage or love or beauty, he would be so excited and he would run to meet them, and then he would begin to engage them in questions about what they claimed to know. And Plato wrote a lot of these dialogues in his writings of Socrates with other people. But at the end of, I believe, every one of these dialogues, Socrates and the person he was questioning come to the realization that that person has no idea what they're talking about. It's just their opinion, their perspective, or their belief. It's not capital T truth that we're trying to search for. But he kept looking, and so much so that the oracle at Delphi declared that Socrates was the wisest man living. And he thought about that for a few minutes. He goes, I suppose I am. Because everyone else thinks they know stuff, but I know I don't know stuff. So I know one more thing than everybody else that I don't know. Point Socrates, right? So good. He was also called the gadfly of the gods, because he saw his mission as to be kind of like this annoying insect to harass and bug people and get them out of their complacency and start asking questions about, is this the way the city should be run? What does love really mean? Why are we worshiping the gods? Those kind of questions ultimately ended up getting him in trouble. As you can imagine, the people that loved him were the people that weren't in the top 10%. It was young people who loved taking his questions home to their parents. But imagine a scenario like this. He's teaching some of his young students, they're hanging on every word, and one of them says, gotta go, Socrates. Our family's offering a bowl to Athena this afternoon. And Socrates says, what's Athena gonna do with the bowl? And the kid goes home and asks his dad, what's Athena gonna do with the bowl? And he's like, don't blaspheme, boy. Who put that kind of stuff in your head? He's like, that Socrates guy, right? And so eventually, Socrates has annoyed enough people where he's actually brought on trial before the city of Athens. And the charges were like sacrilege, defaming the gods, and corrupting the youth. And when they asked him what they thought his punishment should be, he said, I think you should make a life-size statue in my honor and offer offerings every day, thanking the gods that I was alive at the same time as you. With which they promptly condemned him to death, but they felt bad afterwards, and they actually tried to make it so he could escape. But his view of the city was, Athens is like my parents, and if my parents want to put me to death, put me to death. If you want me to live and flourish, let me live and flourish. And so he became like the first martyr to philosophy, where he would rather die for what he believed was a quest for truth than to flee the city that birthed him and gave him that place and that position. Now, after Socrates, it's very hard for me personally, I'm not enough of a scholar to tell where Socrates ends and his great disciple Plato begins, because we don't have any writings from Socrates. Everything we have by him was written by Plato. But I don't know if Plato was covering his own butt by saying, this is what Socrates said, you already killed him. You can't kill me for just reporting what he said, or if this was actually Plato's thoughts, just using a pseudonym to protect himself. I don't know. But regardless, Plato becomes one of the primary philosophers in the West, even to this day. And then Plato's disciple, Aristotle, became that pivot point between the two. So I'm going to present those two together because they're going to have such a huge impact on our thinking and on the rest of this class. Okay, so with Plato and Aristotle, when you take ethics with me, they'll both come up again, but we'll be focusing more on their moral theories. So right now I want to focus more on their epistemology. And remember what that big word meant, epistemology. Theory of knowledge, very good. Theory of knowledge. How do we know, can we know things? The skeptics believed we couldn't. Socrates believed we could. So did Plato and Aristotle. But how we know things, very different. We've also moved into a much broader sense of philosophy. These guys aren't just looking for the underlying substance of all things, but they're encyclopedic in their mind. They're dealing with politics, with religion, with the physical world, with the metaphysical world, with morality, with aesthetics, beauty, all these different things they're trying to hit. And we have much of their writings, if not all, today, which is amazing to think about. Plato becomes the father of idealism, and Aristotle becomes the father, they call him the father of realism, but I take umbrage to that term. I would rather call him the father of materialism, to contrast idealism. What this means is, Plato believes that ideas equal reality. In other words, thoughts are more real than things. Yes. Where Aristotle is saying, no, matter equals reality. Or things equal reality. And then we can think about those things. So I'm going to start with Plato, and then we'll flip it on its head. So you've probably all heard the concept Platonic love. Okay? Anyone want to take a gander of what Platonic love means? It's supposed to be a higher love, right?
No, not.
Is that how you understand it?
That's what I've been told it was.
Like a lesser love?
Like friends on love.
How sad. See, you've been taught by materialists who think that the carnal, physical lovemaking is more real. Plato's saying no. It's that ideal, the love of the mind, the love of the soul, the love beyond physicality. It's that higher love, that perfect love, that can't be tainted by physical material things. Fascinating. Oh, me too. Sorry, I didn't mean to give my stance, but it's going to show anyways. So in Platonism, he sees this in kind of degrees. And so the highest degree of reality is called the realm of ideal forms. And what he means by this is everything you can possibly think of, conceive, or imagine has always and eternally existed as a thought, as a concept, as an idea. When I first was learning this, I was your age in college, all I could think of was like this cosmic, universal, eternal, like Frigidaire. And just this refrigerator that had been there from all before time and all this, and it was this template of all things having to do with refrigeration. But that's kind of like what he's talking about. He's basically saying there is nothing new under the sun. Anything that you see was first a thought or an idea in someone's mind. Think about this room. Everything in this room was first a concept. Someone actually thought about this whiteboard to replace a blackboard in their mind. They conceptualized it, and then they physically manifested it through raw materials on this earth. Every chair in here, someone had a concept or an idea of chairhood or chairness in their mind, and then they constructed physical material chairs. Fascinating. That coffee mug, that beautiful coffee mug, someone first conceived of this in their mind, then they took physical clay on a wheel, spun it, glazed it, and produced this. But it first started by a concept or an idea. And each and every one of you was first an idea or concept in the mind of God before he physically manifests you. Woo! Go Plato. So I'm just going to put Fred's world up here. People, trees, coffee mugs. And we'll do some abstract concepts like love, or maybe geometric shapes. Everything's there. Nothing new. Now you can rearrange things into novel ways, but you can't come up with something completely entirely new. It's been there for all eternity. These things cannot be created or destroyed. They are eternal ideas or concepts. Now below the realm of the ideas or the ideal forms, we have the conceptual world. And humans, or sentient beings, part of how we know things is we have like this, almost like a holographic chip placed inside of us of this world. And because we have this inside of us, we can think about these things. But because we are physical material beings, there is going to be distortion. We're not going to see things in their purest true form, but the more we contemplate and philosophize about them, we can get higher and higher in our thinking process. So your everyday people, and I'm not trying to be elitist here, but it's hard not to, but say you're a typical blue-collar worker or minimum wage job, something like that, they may actually confuse actual people, trees, and physical coffee mugs. These are representing me, the trees outside, the mug in the room. That's this level of physicality. This is the physical material world down here. But these things are here because they first were here. Now, the common people, the hoi polloi, may actually confuse this with ultimate reality. But once you begin to philosophize and contemplate and understand the true nature of the world and reality and things, you realize that no, we can conceive of people, of trees, of coffee mugs, but these are going to be distorted because of our physical state, because of our human brain, etc. But as we contemplate on higher things, higher principles, we can go from a very crass or carnal human physical love to a higher platonic ideal love, a higher love. Questions, comments? I got time, so I'm gonna give Plato a little more room. You guys know the story of Plato's Cave? I'm gonna give it to the rest of them. Oh, actually, I don't even have to draw it. I got a little video I can show you. So while I pull that up. I could have drawn it by now.
Imagine prisoners that have spent their entire lives chained deep inside a cave. They have been chained so that they cannot see behind themselves, and they are forced to stare endlessly at the cave wall in front of them. Behind them, a fire is burning, and between the prisoners and the fire is a raised walkway. Now imagine that each day, a menagerie of objects crosses the walkway. Animals, and people carrying their wares to market. Their shapes create an intricate shadow play on the wall in front of the prisoners. This is the only world that the prisoners have ever known. The shadows and the echoes of unseen objects. Now, imagine that a prisoner is released. After some time adjusting to the blinding light, the freed prisoner will begin to experience the world outside of the cave for the very first time. And it is like nothing he could have ever imagined. With his new perception of the world, the man will of course want to return to his friends to share his incredible discoveries. But the prisoners cannot recognize their old friend. He appears as all things do. His voice is a distorted echo, and his body is a grotesque shadow. They cannot understand his fantastic stories of the world outside of the cave. To them, it will never exist. This, of course, does not make the world outside of the cave any less real.
love this analogy. Hindus, Buddhists have a similar analogy, but they use the lotus flower growing in the muck is where the roots are, and then the stem comes up through like this dreamlike state, but eventually the leaves open up on top of the water, this beautiful bloom opens in the full light of the sun, kind of showing enlightenment. In the same way, Plato would say, people living down here, it's like they're in a cave, and they're confusing the physical things of this world with ultimate reality. And he says, but it's really like Shadowlands. We're living, seeing through a glass darkly. Things are distorted. They are not as they should be. They're broken. But even worse than that is there is a class of people that is using this to cast shadows on the wall to manipulate and deceive and control people. Who would these people be in our society?
The media.
Media? Oh, yeah, big shadow casters. Who else are shadow casters? Government.
Religion.
Religion. Teachers. Teachers are horrific shadow casters, right? Trying to get you in this little box, to put you in your own new little boxes and new little boxes. And so it's like little boxes upon little boxes of little boxes. And Plato's saying, every once in a while, one of these people, this is the Matrix too, if you're not recognizing it. This is Neo and all those people in the pods being batteries for the machines. But every once in a while, one of these people gets agitated and something doesn't seem right. And they're trying to look over their shoulder. And when one of these people gets loose, they have a choice. Usually these people will offer them to come into these ranks. Like, you figured out the game, we'll give you a spot here. This was in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World and other sci-fi books, this idea, these awakened ones, or the people that see something's wrong, if they're not brought into this, you can see how they become very dangerous, right? Because if they're in here telling everyone it's all a lie, it's a sham, and these people are manipulating us, it's going to be a problem. So either they're incorporated or they're persecuted, or they may flee altogether, because still, you're still in Shadowland. You have to come out of the cave into the actual full light of the day to see truth. And so these are the stages we're seeing here in Plato's hierarchy. And this would be in the full light of the sun, actual trees, actual people. But see, these are the ideal ones. These are the facsimiles. This is the broken copies, not the ideal. Questions, comments on that?
I have a question about the tribes that don't have human contact. Why do you think they're ever going to be contacted or have them come out to what we might think is the real world? Or what do you think makes them think, okay, I don't want to go over there, or what? I'm going to go see what's out there.
You said tribes?
No, tribes.
Tribes.
No, tribes like the Indians.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
I think you said tribes like.
No tribe, thank you very much. Tribes. Plato believes every human has that chip. He doesn't call it that, but that you already, what he's saying is, you already know, including any tribal person of any time, everything there is possibly to know.
So you're just in the
It's kind of like the trauma of being born into this physical material world. It's made you forget. And so imagine how this affects his view of education. He's not trying to teach people data, knowledge, information. He's actually trying to get them to remember what they already know. He saw himself as a midwife, and he's like birthing thought babies with his students. But he's not inseminating them, he's not impregnating them. He is simply helping them bring into the light of day what is already within them. And people mocked him about this. But remember, ancient Athens is a slave-based society. Even though it's a democracy for white males who own property. Very similar to early United States democracy. And so you have this class society. Women are certainly not treated like men, and then slaves certainly don't qualify as free men or people. And so in this culture and society, people are saying, you're trying to tell us that uneducated women and even slaves know as much as us here in the higher echelons of society. And he says, absolutely. And he's like, let me prove it to you. And he marched the little band down into the fields, and he began to question the farmers using simple yes and no questions. And by doing that, they could answer the most elaborate mathematical problems of the day. Because they didn't know the formulas per se. They couldn't just pull up like Pythagoras' theorems and stuff. But by asking them simple questions, they could answer the most complex questions because they already had the base within them on which to function. And even though I don't want to get into ethics and morality so much right now, this is how Plato says we make value judgments. When I see a tree outside, because I have this ideal concept of tree, I can say that is an excellent tree, that is a mediocre tree, and that is a substandard tree. What am I basing that on? This template in my mind. When I bought this coffee mug, I was using the Platonic ideal. And I'm comparing the template in my mind of what the ideal coffee mug is to what I'm seeing in this nice little boutique shop. And as you can see, this comes very close to the Platonic ideal. Could I borrow someone else's? Could I borrow your, it's not quite a mug, but container, thank you. You do, I was gonna flail around. Now, with this idea of the ideal coffee mug, this template in my mind, I can evaluate other mugs, I can evaluate other people, I can evaluate buildings, I can evaluate chairs. These chairs are kind of utilitarian, they're functional, but as far as approximating the Platonic ideal of chairhood, no, not even close, right? But we couldn't afford Platonic chairs at school at this time. I don't think. Yes.
So, aren't all these
I'm going to use
ideals,
that again.
aren't all these ideals subjective though? So what's ideal to me might not be ideal to you.
No, these are objective, and this is what drives people crazy. But because what if two people are debating about these coffee containers, and someone says, "No, Blackman, this is obviously so much better. It's more durable. It's going to keep it warm. I can attach it to my belt." I mean, there's so many advantages, practical, utilitarian advantages of this, whatever it is, compared to this mug. Now, this may be more aesthetically pleasing. There's the handcraftedness, all of that sorts of thing. But you say, that's just your subjective impression. But he would say this goes way beyond mugs or trees or people, even into things like the good, the true, the beautiful. He would see those as absolute, eternal, and objective, and synonyms. The good, the true, and the beautiful. Those aren't perspectival. Beautiful is not relative. It's not in the eye of the beholder. He would say it's you have approximated as closely as humanly possible to that ideal of beauty. What do you guys think? See, most evangelicals are comfortable saying truth is absolute and objective, but your relativistic culture has convinced most of you that beauty is relative. The ancient Greeks saw them as synonyms: the true, the good, and the beautiful. They're not relative, they're not subjective. It's not based on your interest or what it does for you, but there is this cosmic eternal template of what those things mean and what they stand for, what they are. They don't stand for, they are. These things down here is the placeholders. This is the stuff that comes and goes. This is the relative stuff. Fascinating. No questions? Okay. Well, to get Aristotle, all you gotta do is flip Plato on his head. Like I told you, that's what a good disciple is supposed to do. Challenge their teacher. And so Aristotle, even though he greatly respected Plato, he's like, so what you're telling us, Plato, is every single dog in the world, we know it's a dog because there's some doghood concept in the cosmos, this abstract, eternal concept of a dog being. And Aristotle says, no, you have to start down here with the physical material worlds, with actual individual dogs. So Aristotle says you start with things like trees, people, and coffee mugs, and by comparing a lot of different trees, I can find what is that universal that we call tree. I don't start with a universal like Plato, and then when I see something that lines up to it, I say, oh, that's a tree. We start with physical trees, and then we look at what separates them from, say, a bush or a flower or a person. And then we use reason to take things from the material world, and we think our way up to, from individuals to universals. So Aristotle's not opposed to this idea of universals. He's just saying they follow the particular. Where Plato says, no, the universal comes first, and then it disseminates into the particulars. Fascinating. So back to the coffee mug analogy. Plato would say the way we evaluate things is we look at different operations. For example, he would start, I like to call him a materialist because of this, he would start with the material physical world. So there's no cosmic concept of coffee mug. Maybe one day you're out in the fields and there's some gourd growing, but it's been broken or bitten into and it's dried out and it had rained overnight, and here's this gourd, this broken gourd, and it's filled with rainwater. And using human reason, you're thinking, oh, wow, we could like actually intentionally grow gourds, cut them in half, and use them for like cups or mugs. So he's taking what's physically there, then using human reason to create, build on, name, and evaluate. And so he starts with material cause. So in this case, the material cause here would be clay, or in this case, metal. We're starting with the ancient Greeks with these building blocks, these material substances. But then you have to think of what is it that's taking that material and turning it into these beverage containers. And that would be like the human engineer or artist. Engineer in this case, artist in that case, right? And so, say you have a block of marble. The material cause is the marble. The artist is the one who is chiseling or working at the marble to release what's inside. The formal cause might be a statue. So somewhere inside here he sees some form that he wants to bring out. And then the final cause, it might be like an offering or memorial. Something to put on a temple or on a gravesite. And so he's seeing it in these terms. You start with the physical, you bring an agent to interact with the physical material, you have a formal cause in mind, and then a final end to which things go. And so this is very helpful with Aristotle, I believe, is he makes a distinction between actuality and potentiality. So for example, an acorn has the potential to become a great oak tree. An acorn is not an oak tree, but it has the potentiality to become one. Okay. A child is not a man, but it has the potential to grow up, become an adult, and then produce its own children. And so that would be like, what is the end goal of an acorn? I would assume it's to become a tree to produce more acorns. A human to grow up, become an adult, replicate into the future. That would be an actualized human in this example. So Aristotle, if he's evaluating these two mugs instead of Plato, he's going to look at form and function. He's going to say, well, this looks like a beverage container. It feels like a beverage container. It smells, it tastes like a beverage container. It's functioning as a beverage container. Ipso facto, it must be a beverage container. But he's making that judgment on what it does and how it functions, not about some abstract, universal, eternal idea. So weird. Two guys, teacher, student, and they're just like opposite sides of the coin. But even though on the surface it looks like they're saying completely opposite things, it's the same pattern. Do you see that? One simply starting from, Aristotle starting from the physical working its way to the metaphysical, and Plato is starting with the ideal or metaphysical and working its way down to the physical. And so I personally believe they're really just showing us two sides of the same coin, and they have a different emphasis on where it goes. But depending where your emphasis is, on the physical material or on the ideal, you could see how that could change everything. My personal theory, when you look at Western civilization, when you have a balance in culture between the idealism of Plato and the pragmatic realism of Aristotle, you just have golden ages of art, architecture, literature, all medicine, all these sorts of things, because you have these ideals to drive you, these visions, but you also have the practicality to produce it, to create the arch, to make the dome, to make the aqueducts, to make, these sorts of physical, practical things. It's not just that concept. Now, if it just becomes conceptual, you can end into this like mystical, where people are sitting staring at the ends of their noses because they're just living in their heads. Because why come out into all this brokenness when the perfection is in here, right? Inside. Or if you're only materialistically minded, it becomes kind of base and trite and shallow when there's nothing deep or transcendent to go with your physical productions. But we see this again in like the late Middle Ages. It's called the High Gothic period. That's my favorite period of art, architecture. It's just, but it's where Plato and Aristotle have once again kind of come together. And then materialism, Aristotle's view kind of took over in the modern era with modern science, all that sort of stuff. But I believe we are living in a time where there's been like a Platonic idealistic revival. And I think you're seeing a lot of that creativity and stuff coming from that blend of the pragmatism with the idealism. All right, any other questions, comments, thoughts? Nothing about these guys?
I see what you mean about the architecture.
Pulled up some Gothic.
Yeah.
So where are you guys at in here? I'm curious. How many of you would relate more to like this Platonic idealistic way of thinking, or more on the pragmatic materialistic way of thinking? And I'll try not to judge you. How many Platonists do I got in here? Good, a few A's in the class, and how many Aristotelians? It's so great. Luther said, reason was Aristotle's little whore. Because he would use reason over the ideal, right? It's so interesting. Or focus on this material world. But we have modern Western logic thanks to Aristotle. He wanted to find out, how can we know if something is logical? Now, I want to caution you, Just because something's logical does not make it true. But it does make it rational as opposed to irrational. Okay, so, are you familiar with Aristotle's syllogism? It's where he takes axioms, and if you have true axioms, you can come to logical conclusions. And if your axioms are true, there's a good chance your conclusion could be true, but not always. So let me give you a quick example. Here's one of the famous ones. Axiom 1. All men are mortal. Axiom 2. Socrates is a man. And now you can come to a conclusion. If those both are true statements, we can logically conclude Socrates is mortal. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah. Easy peasy. It's the beginning of formal logic in the West that I'm aware of anyways. And it's got much more involved now. I mean, if you've ever looked at a philosophical logical textbook, it's just like math. It's just math equations, and it's quite mind-bending. But this has become kind of like the standard in Western thinking. At least, I mean, I'm not so sure at the moment, but this is where we have been headed. We have been like a truth-based culture. And this is an attempt at trying to find the difference between truth and falsehood. Also in his logic, he talks about correspondence theory of truth. Is that an E or A?
Yeah.
It is an E or an A? Correspondence theory of truth and the law of non-contradiction. When we say law or proofs in philosophy, it's not the same as a scientific law or proof, but we could say it's a strong argument. But I just don't want you to get confused, like, oh, it says a law of, so it must be true. No, but it does mean it's a really strong argument or theory. These are going to become important later, so I'll refer back to them. Correspondence theory of truth basically says any truth claim has to correspond to reality. Now, Aristotle's the one saying it, so what does he mean by reality? Right. So if I say my coffee mug is in my hand, that is not corresponding to reality, because physically my coffee mug is sitting on that table. So that would be a false statement. If I now say the coffee mug is in my hand, that's a true statement. It corresponds to reality. That's correspondence theory of truth. The law of non-contradiction is a little bit more involved. And what it's saying is A equals A, and non-A does not equal A. Or in other words, something cannot be one thing and another simultaneously. This is where we get that either-or distinction in the West. Something is either black or it's white. It's right or it's wrong. It's high or it's low. It's good or it's evil. Okay? That's the idea behind this. And most of you, this is the way you think, in a very black and white, either or, this or that sort of thinking. I mean, I see Christian theologians, apologists use this all the time. So let me ask you a question. Is Jesus God or man? Aristotle would say you're being irrational, because something cannot be one thing and another thing at the same time. Whoops. I'm kind of obsessing on this show called The Good Place right now. And there's a scene where Eleanor, one of the main characters, she doesn't want to get caught and gets into the real bad place. She thinks she's in the good place. but she's also committed to trying to find out what's wrong in the good place neighborhood they're living in, and the problem is her. So she's got to figure out how to help find the problem and not help find the problem, which is her, at the same time. And her moral philosophy buddy friend says that's impossible, but he's an Aristotelian in his thinking. He's thinking you either are helpful or you're not helpful. And without missing a beat, she whips out, well, actually you can be helpful and unhelpful at the same time. Like when I was my cousin's date at his high school prom, helping him, and later his therapist telling me, not helping him. And on that note, we'll pick up next week.